Welcome to Finding Certainty with your host and U.S. Army veteran, Patrick Lang. Over the next hour, you'll learn from Patrick and his expert guests how to attract more certainty into your business and your life. Now, here is your host, Patrick Lang.
Welcome back to Finding Certainty, everybody. We're very pleased today to have two icons in the industry, Mr. Jason Miller and Philip Lanos. They are the co-hosts of the Strategic Advisor Board War Room Roundtable podcast. That's a mouthful. They have a lot to offer and a lot of insights and experience to share with us. So really looking forward to visiting with you guys. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Great to be here, Patrick.
So I always start out by having you tell us just a little bit about yourselves. We've got three of us today on the show, obviously, and because you are co-hosts, you tag team on this extraordinarily popular podcast. I mean, what is it? Top 1.5% globally. That is an accomplishment, especially with the fact that you haven't been doing it for years and years. So it's very impressive. We're looking forward to hearing how that's come about and some of the things you've learned and so forth. So why don't we just take turns and have you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'm going to jump into, I always share two reasons why I've invited you on the show, but I always like to start with you. You're the most important part here. So maybe Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. I'm a Montana kid. I grew up in Montana on a farm and learned what that hard work means, right? And joined the military, did 23 years in the military. And really business was in me because my folks were very entrepreneurial. And I wanted to still do that while I was in the military. So I, bought, stripped, flipped businesses, so on and so forth, while I was in the military. And retired from the military, started the Strategic Advisor Board and chair 11 other companies. I won't go into all of them, but actually 12 as of last week. And I love business. To me, that's what it's all about. Podcasting is such an awesome thing. And I'll just quickly even tell the story of how me and Philip even came about being together. So I got interviewed for a segment over at Entrepreneur Magazine, and that guy right there was the guy that ended up doing my interview, and he was working over at Entrepreneur Magazine. Well, I got to tell you, it really inspired me into podcasting. And it inspired me so much. I started the Strategic Advisor Board podcast and it was called War Room Moments. But I did that, I grew it, and I reached out to Philip and I said, "Hey man, you really got to come over here and do this with me." And he was like, "Okay, let's do it." Pretty much. That's the short story of it. And now we're 6 months into it, 250-ish episodes, crushing it in the top 1.5% in the world. So wouldn't be here without Philip, though, for sure. But I'll pass the torch over to you, Philip.
Yeah, man. First of all, I'm just a big fan of anytime I hear your story, it just shows how much life has been lived. I'm like the complete opposite almost in a way, right? Where I was born in the city, but my whole life I moved around a lot. So making first impressions kind of became a survival mechanism for me, like growing up, right? Just to give you some context. And I always wanted to be an entertainer. In fact, when I was a kid and my dad was around, he would sort of put me up to it and be like, "Hey, do the dance or the song for the," and he'd throw on like "Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door." And that was like my jam as a kid. Kind of a morbid song for a kid to love, but I just remember those lyrics. And as I started moving around more, I picked up skateboarding. But one thing that I always loved doing was connecting with people, because connection seemed to be a thing that never was permanent for me, right? Which has led to a lot of things as an adult that I'm working through. But one thing that I picked up is I had a chance to move to New York, and I did. And in moving to New York, looked around the city, saw all the ads, and said, well, I could get a job trying to make it as an actor, singer, what have you. Or clearly people are spending money on these ads. They are not cheap, especially in New York. So I'm going to go there since money seems to be there. I didn't know how strategic this thinking was. I've always read, but I did that. And lo and behold, when I landed in the marketing agency, after a couple of other people offered me internships, this place actually offered me a job. I started learning all these things about the business world that I didn't know beyond what I had been reading. You read things and you think you know what business is until you start working for a company that's small but mighty and is actually doing stuff. And you're like, wow, like this is actually how money is made. I had no other point of reference. Before that, I was just an employee, but this company actually left a lot of room for you to own things, to take ownership of stuff. And through that, I eventually got the bug to go, do things myself. And one of the things I took with me was the idea of podcasting really early on, like 2013 going into 2014. And that's really where I started getting into things, which eventually led to me helping other people launch their podcasts and their personal brand and content strategy. But then somewhere along the way, I ran into somebody who gave me a shot with Entrepreneur Magazine. Then I helped them launch an Inc. Magazine podcast. There was a shift in CEO, which sort of tanked that Inc. Magazine podcast. I think that episodes may not even play, even though they're still listed and like online. You can see them. And in the middle of all that, along the way, I ran into Jason, as he tells you in the story. And, I remember him specifically emphasizing the importance of a marketplace in his episode, and I was like, yeah, like Amazon. He's like, yeah, but Jason meant it deeper than that, but I remember how important of an emphasis he placed on that. So then when I saw him connect with me on LinkedIn and he's like, hey man, we should have you on the show. I was like, I'd love to, man, of course. And once I showed up, I saw the way he was running and I was like, you did how many? So it's only been a little while since I see you did 60 episodes already. I was like, all right, man. Yeah. We started having that conversation and lo and behold, my reaction then is my reaction now. Every other day, Jason will hit me up with some of the numbers that we're doing. And I'm like, what? Because what I do, a lot of what I do is I sit there and I talk to people. And as you know, it's something that I've had to learn how to do really early on in my life, right? So I do that. But a lot of the magic is left up to the world and that strategic mind of Jason Miller.
Right. I think it's really interesting. I was on your show a few weeks back. I think it was in August, and just seeing how you two play off each other. You have such diverse backgrounds, and yet they really blend into this one just perfect whole. And I'm not surprised you're doing so well as a podcast and as podcasters, because you really resonate with each other, and it's impressive. And you're very different from each other, right? I mean, kind of like black and white or different ends of the spectrum, right? It's really interesting. But isn't that kind of how business goes in general? I mean, in a lot of relationships. I mean, my wife and I are polar opposites, right? My business partners and I are very different from each other, and that synergy of reciprocal differences is really a fascinating thing. We could do a whole show just on that topic, I think.
Yeah.
So
no, that's valid. I was literally just going through a list of people that I know near me, because a lot of what I've been doing has been very remote, like wherever people are in the world. And
right.
I started realizing I'm the kind of person, I become alive around people. And the work from home, doing things only at home scenario is starting to, I believe, personally make me go crazy. And so I started asking myself, like, look, I've talked to a lot of people. I need to start looking at who I know and start like going to go do things. As we talked about before we even started the show, life exists outside of work.
That's right. We sometimes forget that, right? But it definitely does. It's interesting. I grew up in a family business. We talked about this on your show, and I look at the lessons that I learned from growing up in a family business. We franchised it, all over the world, all over the country, and even overseas. And you look at the lessons you learned from the military, Jason. I learned from the military. Philip, you've learned from your background and your exposure in media and marketing and all these things. Isn't it fascinating how those lessons accumulate? And we look back on the last year or the last 5 years or 10 years, I think, man, I was a completely different person. I have these steady principles and steady beliefs and so forth, but we continue to expand and grow. And it's fascinating. You don't see it happening while it's happening, but you could look back on it and it's extraordinary. I mean, how do you think, Jason, how do you think you've grown just since you got out of the military? I know the military, you grew up through the ranks and grew up through those experiences. I mean, I experienced that the same. We were both in the Army, if I'm not mistaken. Or were you Marine Corps?
Army, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So you were in the right branch at least, but just kidding.
Oh, that's funny.
But I mean, I guess the first question is, how did you see yourself grow in the military, and how does that compare to how you've grown since you've gotten out, got your MBA, and started Strategic Advisor Board and so forth? Do you see parallels, or has it been different?
Well, I think you got to go back a long, long way, right? I think you have to go all the way back to birth, really, right? Because as humans, we are meant to evolve, right?
Absolutely.
And we evolve over time. Whether you like it or not, you are going to evolve, right? You're going to evolve because the world and the ecosystem around us changes so much that we're literally forced to evolve and adapt and change and be more flexible and all these different things. So I don't know if it's really so much of change more than it is an evolution of when we were born to where we are today, right? But
right.
When I look at, who I was, say, even 10 years ago, it's a much different person, right? Because then, and that it really applies to everything, all the way down to, well, I used to hate salsa 10 years ago. Now I love it, right? So it's like, now I can't get enough of it. That's a stupid thing to say, but I mean,
that's great.
It's just a silly little tiny example of how we evolve and things change, right? So, and we're exposed to so many things during the years and years that we're alive, and hopefully we get better, not go the opposite way. We don't devolve. Is that the right word?
It sounds good.
We're always constantly moving forward. And if we always just strive to be one thing, and that's a lifelong learner, we'll continue to evolve and get better and better. That's
a really good insight.
Yeah.
It's like I used to set New Year's resolutions every year, and I'd have a big list or maybe a small list, but like most of us, resolutions don't last very long. At least they didn't for me. I think many people can resonate with that, but I finally made a goal about 5 years ago to do one resolution each year. And that resolution was to try to listen to every impression that came, every prompting, every insight. And doesn't mean I do everything that comes to me, but to try to pay attention to it, whether you believe in God or the universe or just intellect, synergy. I really made a goal to be a learner in that sense, Jason, but to listen, right? And to become a better listener. I believe a lot of the impressions that come from a higher source. And I think he knows way better than I do how to go and where I should be going and what I should be doing. And so just listening to those impressions in that direction has really helped me do more. And you see doors and windows opening, relationships happening. I mean, just meeting you guys, for example, and others like that. I think a lot of that has come about by being guided and listening to that guidance, and both from mentors and from, higher power and from experience and so forth. And so being a lifetime learner, a lot of that I think comes down to being a really good listener. Would you agree with that, Philip? Have you experienced the same thing?
Yes, and more. Yes, evolution is key, and listening helps guide your evolution in a way that's productive. Absolutely. I would say active listening, which is another way of saying critical thinking,
Right.
is a pretty good bet in life if you just actively listened. And active listening really involves three parts, right? Actively accepting, actively rejecting, or actively confused. And if you find yourself actively confused, ask a question, man. That's the way I usually go, and that's what I use even when I interview people, believe it or not.
Yeah, you're a great example of that. I saw it in our interview. You aren't just thinking about your next question. You aren't just, you don't have an agenda. You talked a little bit about how you just let the conversation flow and take it where it takes it. And I want to get into that a little bit more as we talk about podcasts and your podcast in general, what you guys have accomplished, and maybe some of the insights for our listeners. But it's a really interesting topic. The one piece I might disagree with is that we don't devolve, as you said, Jason. I don't know if that's a word, but I think that in every relationship, in every person, we're either progressing or regressing, digressing, right? We're either getting better or getting worse. It's kind of like atrophy, right? If you don't use your muscles, you lose them. And same with a marriage, or a relationship. It's either getting stronger or getting weaker. It doesn't happen overnight, but I do believe that's true. Same with a testimony. It's same with a skill, language ability. I lived in Italy for a couple of years. I was an interpreter with the Army in Italian. And I know if I don't use my Italian, I start to lose it, right? And so I think there's this evolution or this kind of regression or sliding backwards if we're not actively pursuing it. So that's something you guys would agree with? Any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just, we've all seen it, right? We've all seen or met people in our lives, and then somehow the path brings us back together and you go, whoa. What happened to you?
Don't even
man?
recognize you.
What
Right?
happened to you, man? Right. And those are trials and tribulations of life. Some people get through them, and then some people get caught in them. Right. So,
right.
We hope as a people that we continue to move forward, not backwards, obviously.
Right. It's a great comment.
Yeah.
We're coming up on our next break. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, Phil, but maybe we'll go to break first. But to that point, let me just share one insight. This is more of a kind of a scriptural or a religious insight. I heard it at church, just to be clear, but we're talking about repentance, right? We're talking about how people get off the path and they start going down lanes they shouldn't, making bad choices, or maybe get into an addiction or something. And there's this false belief that we have to go back to where we were. We somehow have to return to where we started to get back on the path. And that's not possible, for one thing. And it's not even smart, right? We're going to waste energy and regret and belief and so forth trying to rewind things, right? When all we have to do is turn left or turn right and get back on the path where we are. Things are going to be different. We will have lost out on opportunities, maybe damaged relationships. We're going to have to do some repair and so forth, but we just need to get back on the path. You think of pilots flying a plane, they're constantly off course. They're never on course. They're constantly making these little minor corrections. The same thing happens when we're driving down the road. Our hands are never still, right? They're constantly correcting, keeping us in our lane. And so I think it's an interesting insight talking about evolution and progress, which is a big thing that I know you talk about, Jason, with Strategic Advisor Board. I think we just got to get back on path, and it's an easy fix. It's a minor correction more often than not. I think we make it harder than it has to be. So lots more to talk about. We're going to go to a quick break, everybody. We're here with Jason Miller and Philip Lanos of the Strategic Advisor Board podcast, very honored to have you guys with us, and we'll be right back.
All right, great job, guys. All clear?
Thanks,
All
man.
right, cool. Let me.
Jason's gonna take a bathroom break.
I can't
We,
see myself.
Oh, okay.
That little box was over my face the whole time. I was
yeah.
like,
Mm.
man, hopefully my shirt isn't sticking up all goofy or something.
Oh, you look good, man.
Are you kidding me? I was born like this. Look at this mop. I just need to trim it all down, have no hair at all times.
I can fix that for you.
Zzz.
I do this myself every 2 weeks.
There it is, man.
It's funny. I was on a call last week, and we are still recording, guys, just so you know. But this is kind of the fun part, is the chat between the call. But
Behind the scenes.
yeah, the behind
Yeah.
the scenes. I was on a call last week, and every guy on there was bald. There were 4 other people and me,
Oh, wow.
and they were just giving me crap because I had this full head of hair, and both my grandfathers died with full heads of hair. I said, I'll never be bald. And they were like, you should just shave it. You'd be way more handsome. You'd look just like us, you know. And I was like, yeah, no
That's
thanks.
funny.
I had an uncle who took me to Camp Pendleton once, and everyone said that very same thing to me. We can fix you up, boy.
Yeah.
I was like, that's when I also
Yep.
discovered there's no taxes if the store is on base. I was like, what? That was the first
Yeah,
time
that's
I ever
right.
heard of that concept. I was like, what? It was yeah. That was an interesting time. I can't say that I've ever had another experience like going on a base. I don't even remember what I was doing there, to be honest with you. But yeah, San Diego.
That's cool. I lived in San Diego for a long time before we relocated here to Henderson, Nevada. So I remember living in Italy. One of our friends had a pass to get on base at the naval base, and we'd go in. I mean, we're living in Italy, right? Best food in the world. We'd go on base and buy
Yeah.
Wonder Bread and macaroni and cheese and some bologna, you know, because we were craving American food. Is that just crazy?
I just want simple.
I just want some Jello, you know. Yeah, it
Sorry,
was.
let's jump in, but we're coming back in just a few seconds.
All right, here we go.
You're listening to Finding Certainty with Patrick Lang. Have a question for Patrick or his guests? Join us on the show at 866-472-5790. That's 866-472-5790. Now, back to the show with Patrick.
You're listening to Finding Certainty, and we're on with Jason Miller and Philip Lanos of Strategic Advisor Board Podcast, one of the top podcasts in the world, literally 1.5% globally, which is quite the accomplishment, guys. I don't know if you got lucky or you're just really that good. We'll have to figure that out as we go along here. I think it's probably the latter, right?
Maybe a little of both.
A little bit of both, yeah. Isn't that kind of how life works?
Yeah, right.
So we're having a conversation just a little bit about Jason and Philip's backgrounds. And, you know, I always bring guests on for 2 main reasons, or I like to highlight those 2 reasons. And one is that podcasting is becoming such a really phenomenal delivery method, right? For getting a message out, for sharing insights, building a brand, and so forth. And you guys are just consummate professionals at that. And so that's the first thing. But 2, as we were saying before, I really like the way you 2 bring these opposing viewpoints and differing backgrounds. I mean, you're different ages, you got military background, non-military, marketing, business. It just makes for a really interesting blend that I'm enjoying getting to know you guys. And I think our listeners would as well if they take the time. So let's talk about your show a little bit. I wish we could talk for hours. We could go into a lot more detail, but maybe just for anyone who is new to podcasting or doesn't even know what it is, that might be a dumb question, but maybe Philip, maybe you can just define what a podcast is. And then, why do you think it's such an effective method of promotion? Then let's get into your show and maybe some tips for the listeners.
Okay. Yeah. What a podcast is could be made up by the case by case basis of the host, right? Because I could take the War Room podcast, for example. It's clearly an exploration of someone's life, and to put it up as an allegory in a professional context to discover what insights we can share with people from their experience. So it's sort of a, can we borrow from your experience? But that's not always the case, is it? Because then you have serial podcasts that are more focused on true crime stories, right? So if we're looking at what podcast quite literally is, it is long form content designed to educate or entertain. That's really what it is, and it really depends on what you're looking for. But I think that's the vehicle that we're using, is a long form content in an age where long form content really doesn't exist anymore, right? Everything is TikTok, 15 seconds, 60 minutes, is not a thing anymore.
Right. That's a great definition. I think it actually appeals to people in many respects because it is long form, right? We get so much that is just snippets and glimpses and sound bites. I think there's this internal need or a craving for some more context, right? So more substance. And I think that's one thing that podcasts or radio shows like this, where you really get to talk, provide. And I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's a really interesting insight. So anything you'd add to that, Jason? I mean, why do you think the podcast method or of promotion is so effective, so popular?
Well, I think for us, it's because we get to share people's story, right? And that's part of our focus is, what is your story? That's one of the first things we always say, because people ask, what do I need to do to prepare? Nothing. Your only job is to tell your story, right? And that story is what's so relatable to people. And we're just in a time of the next news cycle or so on and so forth, and short snippets of this or that, like Philip was saying. But people have really come back now, I think, to want to connect with other people's stories, right? Because people want to feel like there are other people like them, right, out there that they can connect with. And really be able to synergize in a whole different way, right? Whether that's driving to your office in the morning, or driving back, or at lunch, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And, the War Room was designed because business is war in its own sense, right? And we get to share them war stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's the whole point of the podcast in the first place, is there is no censorship in it, right? You get to hear it all, the good, the bad, and the awful, right? But imagine being a young leader that's 23 years old, that's starting a company today, that starts on episode 1 and ends on episode 200 and whatever we're on. All the arrows they got to miss, because they got all those stories of all those business owners that, shared all those things that worked and didn't work. And podcasting is a beautiful form to be able to share that kind of information in the world, because it's intentional, right? People know they have to set aside 30 minutes, 40 minutes, because that's what a podcast is. So it's intentional that way.
Right. People don't usually stumble on a podcast over and over and over, right? They may stumble on it the first time, but then it draws them in, of course, depending on the content and the quality and so forth. But it's interesting, Philip, you talk about the true crime podcasts and the mystery podcasts, and some of these that are not interview related, not necessarily business related, but they're still telling a story, right? And it has that same element obviously built into it. I think really great business podcasts are doing the same, as you referenced, of telling stories and explaining histories and insights and how they all blend together. And so it's interesting. Tell us a little bit about your podcast specifically. How often is it do you do it? I know you've got over almost 250 episodes now in just 6 months. I mean, the quantity is impressive in and of itself, right? I mean, I know you're recording podcasts almost every day, isn't that right?
I mean, that definitely is I think a powerful source of fuel for anything to gain traction, right? Is, can you do it consistently? And
Right.
I mean, I just followed Jason's lead. I'll be honest with you. And he pointed out, this is how many interviews we have lined up. As soon as I started, I was like, all right, well, let's go. At some point there was even more of them, and I was like, let's do it. And then I was like, hey man, how many episodes are we gonna do? He's like, actually, I got a plan. And I was like, yeah. He's like, yeah, and then we'll move them over to here now. But there is a lot of episodes in a short amount of time. But whether it was by design or not, it had a big it plays a big factor in, not only, imagine you're trying to learn to swing a bat. If you swing it only once a month, your game, same thing with golf, right? Only gets so good. The reps that you do. Now, I happen to have been doing something very similar to that volume beforehand with Entrepreneur, right? I think in the time that I was there with entrepreneur.com, it was pretty much that exact model. So to come right into it again, it was pretty, I could notice it right off the bat. And the only difference is we're running the show way different than they are. And the quality of guests that we have are way different than Entrepreneurs. So I got lucky running into Jason, because it wasn't always a Jason Miller when I was on Entrepreneur, right? So I think the interesting thing about podcasting, since that's the broader subject that we're on, and how you align things, right? Whether it is a documentary style podcast or an interview style podcast, or, believe it or not, a round table style podcast where interruptions are the norm, right? I think whatever format you choose, don't ever count out how important the kind of guest that you bring on is. Because if you think you're going to make hamburgers out of, let's say, I don't know, spinach, I mean, you could do that. There's a whole market now. It's a vegan market, but it's not the same thing. You know what I mean? And so it's important that you take into consideration all the elements as a cook that you're throwing into the dish in the kitchen, to be able to determine like what the meal is going to be like. And it is an art to be able to tastefully, it's a matter of taste. You've got to have taste, right? Whatever vertical you're in, whatever industry you're in, if you're creating a communications piece, you have to have your finger on the pulse and the taste. And something about hosting is having taste as a host, of how do you tastefully ask a question that relates and can open things up even further without getting too far away from the point of the conversation itself. It takes taste, and you can't read about taste and then go and have taste. It's something that is developed through experience, through failure to have taste at all, and go, wow, that wasn't tasteful at all. Then you just got to sit there and live with it. And if you do that long enough, and with enough repetitions at the number and volume of episodes that we have, you eventually start to really get a feel for things.
Right. It's really good insight, and I think that taste, that ability to define and what is a good guest and what you're looking for, and then being able to guide that conversation is more than just the quantity of podcasts you've done. It's the lives that you've lived. It's the experience that you've had, right? It's like I keep getting compliments on our show and feedback from Voice America, the general manager. They say, man, you sounds like you've been doing this for years. Not to pat myself on the back, but they've been really complimentary and really encouraging. And they say it's largely because you come across as authentic. I think that authenticity is a real big piece of it. But also it's because I've done hundreds of interviews. I've done thousands of presentations, training. So I may be new to this format, but I'm drawing from, years and years, 30 plus years of experience. And so I think it's an important insight. Anyone can start a podcast, but I find the very best ones are when the hosts have got some real life experience, right? Reminds me of that book by Malcolm Gladwell. It's called The Outliers.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that? I think it's just Outliers, not but he talks about how it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in something, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. He gives examples like Bill Gates and programming and, others. But I mean, you made a reference a few minutes ago, Philip, about Jason, how he's a strategic, genius. And I think Jason, talking about the quality of the guests you guys have, because your interviews are phenomenal. I've listened to several of them. I think mine was definitely the weak link in all the interviews you've done, but the tell us a little bit more about just the type of guests you've had and maybe some of the insights you've had, because I agree, the quality of the guests, and in addition to the quality of the host, it makes for the perfect recipe, as Philip said. Anything you would add to that, Jason?
So it's funny because I'll go back to like 3 months ago. Me and Philip had this guy, I won't name his name, but and we got off of that podcast. I mean, we were like, yeah, that's not going anywhere, right? And it turned out to be like one of the most listened podcasts we've had. I mean, people just loved it. So you can't really predict necessarily what people are really going to be interested in or not. But I mean, our focus is business owners that have been, they've been in their own war room. That's the whole point, right? I mean, we're not trying to interview the next Mary Kay delivery person or something like that, right? We want, seasoned CEOs that have been in the mud and muck, and they've been drug around it, and they've been through all the hardships. And that's what really makes the show so valuable, is that right there.
Right.
Anything to add to that, Philip?
Yeah. I think it's a lot like in the music industry. Artists never know which of their songs are going to gain traction and popularity. Even when you're like that, like for example, Radiohead's song, The Creep, right? They actually, as a band, don't enjoy playing it anymore, but it is the most requested song. You just have to go to a bar that plays karaoke to see that song in action. It is that popular with people, and yet the band themselves are like, So yeah, while whatever I said sounded insightful, it's also true that you just never know, and there are outliers everywhere, like you said, right? Some people actually have a following, and while they may not present themselves well, they do actually get results for people in their own industries and hubs. And so, yeah, if I were to say anything, is never count somebody out, but also do your best to pick the fruit that doesn't have any spoiling on it, if possible.
Yeah, it's not always the easiest thing to do. Easier said than done. But we are coming up on another break here. But I think of, as we talk about this topic, I think earlier you talked about evolution, right, Jason, and how we're constantly getting better. I know your whole podcast, you're really, the focus has been on changing lives, and how you're changing lives with that podcast. You're giving younger entrepreneurs and business owners a chance to shorten their learning curve. I think that's so valuable. And seeing how people's lives have changed building their businesses. I mean, it's just a really great tapestry of experience. I'm very impressed. But I think we'll come back after the break here and continue the conversation. But we are here with Jason Miller and Philip Lanos, two consummate podcasters and businessmen. We'll talk a little bit more about your business with Strategic Advisor Board when we come back, and maybe a few tips for the listeners on what makes a good podcast. I know we're kind of nibbling around those edges, but think about that while we're on break if you can, and we'll be right back, folks.
All right, great job, guys. We're clear. Back in about 2.
Thanks, man.
I've been holding that cough in the whole time.
Yeah.
Little kids, man, they're like petri dishes, man. They bring everything home.
Yeah.
I was just reading something online last night that said, I thought I had a great immune system until I had a kid and realized
Mhm.
my whole life I just never had someone spit in or cough in my face, but while they were telling me a story. And I said, yeah, that sounds about right.
Kind of like
Isn't that the truth?
last
So
night
you,
with my daughter last night. We're laying in bed reading a story, right? And she
Yeah.
turns over and looks at me and goes, I'm like, appreciate that.
Thanks,
That's
honey.
nice. That's nice. Thanks.
Was it intentional or she just did it?
I think it was intentional.
That's
He's like,
funny.
I'm miserable, so you're gonna be miserable too. I was like, I don't care as long as I get through Friday. That's it. I just gotta get through Friday.
I
'Cause
saw
we got like 8 podcasts stacked up right after this. So
do you really
yeah.
today? Because don't you
Today.
do all your podcasts on one day of
Now
the
we
week?
do. Yeah.
Yeah. 10 a week. Usually
I
10 on
saw-
Friday.
I saw a post on our team chat. We have an app that we built for our company, and here I'll show it to you. I'll share my screen real quick before he comes back. But this was the post. Hooray, it's the weekend. Oh no, wait. I run a small business.
Yeah, that's the truth.
Isn't that the
Some
truth?
truth
Yeah.
to that, all right. Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
If
So
Always
oh, go ahead.
how many children do you have, Jason? You have one daughter, or
Well, I
do you
have
other-
two adults, 23 and 27, and 2 little ones, 3 and 6.
Nice.
Midlife crisis, short of the Corvette. Didn't do the Corvette part.
You know, kids are better than Corvettes, right?
Yeah, right.
I like my kids. I love my children, but I like them less and less the older they get. I really liked them when they were 3 and 6, right?
Yeah, there you go.
And they don't
That's
listen to
funny.
my show, so they'll never hear me say that.
10 seconds, guys.
I guess it's possible, but
Uh,
they grow up
Right.
and they think they know everything, and they don't.
You're listening to Finding Certainty with Patrick Lang. Have a question for Patrick or his guests? Join us on the show at 866-472-5790. That's 866-472-5790. Now, back to the show with Patrick.
And we're back, Finding Certainty with Jason Miller and Philip Lanos. They're the co-hosts of Strategic Advisor Board podcast. I'm your host of Finding Certainty, Patrick Lang. Having a great conversation with these two leaders in the podcast realm, even though they're fairly new to the industry. You'd think they'd been doing it for years. They've already done almost 250 episodes. I mean, that takes most people years to get to that number. We were talking a little bit about quantity, and I want to get into a little bit of talk about quality, because your show is it's definitely not junk content. It's definitely not just, filling up the space. You guys are bringing some really good quality to your interviews, and some really quality guests. So, tell us a little bit more about your show and kind of how it came about. I know you talked about, Jason, how you and Philip got together, but did it start out rough? Did it start out easy? I mean, Philip had been doing it for a long time. I mean, you were new to it, Jason. So did you find a little bit of a learning curve there, or what?
Well, oddly enough, all I did was I used Philip's framework. It was the same framework that he interviewed me by is the framework that I used before we came over and joined forces together when he was at Entrepreneur Magazine. And the War Room has actually been around since 2017, 16, 17. And I used the War Room because war is business. So I've always had this War Room concept where, I work with clients and we work together in the War Room and draw up strategies and all that kind of thing. So it just made sense to continue a podcast called the war room moments, right? Because I could
Right.
share these moments that I had with clients and so on and so forth and have them on the podcast. That's how it all started. They were all clients of mine, sharing their stories and things that we'd been through in the war room. So, but then I really wanted to take that and amp it. And that's why I wanted Philip to be a part of it. So we could create this round table effect, right?
Right.
More of a, less interview-ish and more conversational, right? Where everybody can feel free to just interrupt and change the dynamic of the conversation at any given time. So that's from my perspective starting. Was it difficult? It was new. I wouldn't say it was difficult, but it was new. So it was working out all the back end stuff and editing and all that stuff and putting a team together to do all that kind of stuff. That's the hard part. And that's the part people don't see is
Right.
what it takes to do all that. Philip, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, production is one of the most important things in getting a show to just keep flowing, right? And if you don't have that team in place, like you said, it's definitely not going to go anywhere. I also think pre-production is super important, right? So a lot like most people might listen to that show and think that all I did was show up and then just have a conversation. And while that may be true to a large degree, it doesn't mean that I didn't personally, and I do this with everyone that we interview, I take a hard look at a few things. Their website, do they have any books? Can I find them through a simple Google search? I do all of that personally just to see how it is they're presenting themselves because of the work I do as a personal brand strategist, right? I'm constantly helping people do that, whether they pay me or not. Often it'll be in the middle of a call and I'll, you know what I mean? But I do that outside of podcasting. So I've just developed this habit of being able to look at people very similar to how if you see somebody, they're like, okay, are they breathing heavy? All the things you might look for in a person to see whether or not they're a threat. I don't do that to look for threats, but I look at to find a way to better articulate what I'm about to drive home in that conversation with them.
Right.
The point is always the same, but what I need to know about a person is always really important. I can do it without just being introduced to someone, jumping into a conversation, right? But I think it's very important that you do some pre-production, no matter what. What does that mean?
Right.
Whether it's making sure you have gear that's going to make sense for you and tuning your room beforehand, right? A lot of, I'm sure you've had interviews or podcast episodes where people's rooms sound like, a great chapel, right?
Right.
And then there's the opposite, right? And so a lot of that, I think pre-production, all the sauce is in the pre-production, man.
I agree. I just think if you're going to podcast or do anything, YouTube or radio or whatever, the very least, make sure that you have a good mic and a good maybe a mixing board. I mean, it was the first piece of advice my general manager here at Voice America gave me. He says, invest in a good mic. Go get a Rode, go get an NTX or something like that. It's worth having. And so people keep telling me you have a good voice for radio. I think most of it's the mic, right? So as you talk about your framework, you mentioned his framework. Do you mind sharing what that framework is for anybody who's thinking about running a podcast? Is there more to it than what we've already discussed?
I can go on that. Do you want me to go on that, Jason?
Yeah.
All right.
Take a minute or so. I still want to get into a couple other things before we run out of time here, but
okay,
it'd be great.
Okay, so a lot what people see visibly, right, is that we have a conversation. I prep them for what that conversation might entail. I let them know there's an open-ended question at the end, like, if you could invite anybody to this conversation, having reflected on everything that we talked about, what would that look like? So that sort of thing didn't exist on that entrepreneur show. In fact, it's like every other podcast. If you've ever gone on a podcast circuit to be a guest where they pull out a list of questions and then you might answer one of the questions they already had lined up for later, and they go, oh, wait, that was actually a question I was going to ask you later. Can we just get, or, they're literally just reading questions while they're talking to you. You name it. Those experiences are really bad experiences, right? And that's not how I was running it. In fact, part of the reason why they put even more episodes my way when I was on Entrepreneur was because of that. So that I changed it and made it conversational. However, all of that looks natural, but it's not. There's a lot that I do that I think I don't tell enough people about. And the framework that I'm using is an offshoot, a derivative work from a psychologist named Eric Berne. Eric Berne wrote this book called Games People Play, right? And he created what's called transactional analysis. And it goes into sort of three different phenomenons. There's the parent phenomenon, an adult phenomenon, and the child phenomenon. And at any given moment, people are interacting. You can see it when you become more childlike talking to your kid and you guys are interacting on the childlike level, as opposed to when you have to be a parent suddenly, and now it's parent to child. And that can be a very difficult conversation to have. Whereas you can also be an adult and speak to your child like an adult, right? And there's a game called Now I've Got You, SOB, right? And that game has a lot to do with the idea of, you're at a party, a soiree, a mixer, you see your kid and the dog run into the other room, you're like, okay. Then you hear some glass break, okay? You go to check it out, all of a sudden you look, the kid's sitting there like, and you still ask, who did this, right? What you've done is you've initiated a game. And now they're like, is there a chance I didn't do it? You invited them to lie. And that's a game that people play as opposed to speaking to them like an adult. Okay, can you do me a favor and go get a broom for this? Let's clean this up, right? And then go like speaking to them like an adult, having them activate, right? So then that's the whole work. And I just wanted to give you that context. What really happens is there's an offshoot, a derivative work that then develop what's called the intimacy scale, right? So there's transaction analysis and then there's the intimacy scale. The intimacy scale is an acronym. And I don't know if we have enough time before I get into this. It is about, okay. So would you like to hear this acronym?
Sure.
This acronym is STOP, I'm You, right? Work with me here. It's silence, right? Things, objects, places, then I, myself, right? And you, and then us. So stop, I'm you. And every conversation starts off in silence. It's just the norm. And so there's a very low degree of intimacy. Ironically, when you have a high degree of intimacy, you can be in silence and hence say a lot and still be close and be calm and be okay with each other. So most people live on the shallow end of the conversation, and we live in like things, objects, places. What we're doing right now, I'll point it out, but most people are like, oh yeah, I love fishing, right? Yeah, I love fishing too, right? And you just keep going on fishing, or I love cars. Yeah, I love cars too, right? And you sort of leave it at that. Oh, I went to Paris. Yeah, I went to Paris too, right? You leave it at that, and there's nothing really at stake there. It's when you start shifting over to philosophies and ideas, kind of like what we're doing now, that a level of intimacy has now been increased. And if someone responds in kind with their own philosophies and ideas, well, you can see that they've moved up into the scale with you. You can gauge that. If they respond, yeah, well, all I know is about fishing, they've gone down on the scale and regressed. So now you have to go back there before you can have them meet you further. From philosophies and ideas, right? Things, objects, places, right? Philosophies, ideas, stop, I'm you, right? It starts to transition over to, well, now you can open it up. Well, as for myself, one of the things I'd like for you to know about me is, what about you, right? Then you move it over to us and you can start using us. And so that's a high level of intimacy.
That's good. So Jason, anything that you would add to that? And we've got a couple minutes here before we've got to wrap up. I do want you to, if you don't mind, because I think what you do in your company, the Strategic Advisor Board, is really about creating those relationships and holding people accountable and helping them change their businesses. So maybe give us a business reference or business insight into what you guys do, how it plays with this. You got about 60 seconds. We've got to wrap this up, and I want you to share with people how to get a hold of you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure.
Thanks, Philip.
Well, the beauty behind it is like I have one spectrum with the strategic advisor board, right? And then Philip he's the CEO of his own company called Own the Rhythm. So, and he's really good on his side of things. So it's like the strategy and rhythm together, right? And that's how I really explain that. And that's why it works so well, right? Because we are complete opposites in a lot of ways, but then in a lot of ways, we're a lot the same. So, but the strategic advisor board, which, Philip's an integral part of that, relationships are everything in life, right? And I have built an empire off relationships, and I love to talk to people. I love to do this stuff like this right here, right? So, because that's what really matters. And one really important key thing about business that I would say to share here today would be, don't chase the money, because the money will come. The relationship will create the money. And that's what's a really important takeaway for a young business owner. I shared that with Forbes a couple weeks ago, and, they said it was a profound statement. I don't really know if it's profound or not, but but it is true. Relationships create money. Money doesn't create relationships. So, it's really important to look at it from that way. But Strategic Advisor Board, that's our company, www.strategicadvisorboard.com. Strategic Advisor Board podcast is our podcast, and we do Philip and I do this segment called the War Room Roundtable. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you guys being on the show today. Couldn't agree more with what you've shared. Philip, thanks for breaking down your framework for us. It's really fascinating. I think I'm not surprised your show is going so well. You're able to touch so many companies and businesses with what you do there at SAB. And, I'm not surprised you're being recognized on Forbes and in Entrepreneur, and I'm even Good Morning America and these things. It's impressive. So it's my honor to know you guys. Anybody have any questions about any of this? Text the word certainty to 26786. One of our team members will reach out to you, connect you with Jason or Philip, or answer any other questions you have. We appreciate you being here on Finding Certainty. And come back next week. We've got a fantastic guest who's going to teach you how to benefit from the employee retention tax credit and literally get your money in as little as 30 days or less versus 6 to 9 months like most. So come back next week. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick.
Take it easy.
All right, perfect. Just in time. Great show, guys. All clear.
Thanks, Matt.
All right.
Yep, thank you.
Well, it's great. Good stuff.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks, guys.
That was a good
I was hoping to give you a little more time, but
Yeah, sorry, I got long-winded
there, Jason.
It's
okay.
okay.
My bad.
It's all
But
right.
I
It
think
doesn't-
with
it doesn't matter.
with the focus on podcasting in general, I think that was really helpful, Philip, that insight, because I agree. It's all about relationships. It's all about getting those stories out. And, if there's anything else you'd add while we're still recording the video, Jason, just about any other tips that you'd give for podcasting, I'd love to just add them on here.
I would say, you just have to do it, period. Right. You just have to, because I think the average podcast makes it to like episode 7 and then it's done after that or something like that. Right.
Is that right? Wow.
Because they just lose, I guess the luster of it falls away or whatever. But the way to keep the luster, it's like anything else in life. If you enjoy it, you want to do it. It can't seem like work, right? And I know
Right.
there's sometimes me and Philip are on number 9 on a Friday, and it's like, oh man, one more, maybe they'll no show.
Yeah, I understand that.
Because you feel like a POW,
Right.
But
You're being waterboarded, right?
yeah, but you just drive through it because number one, you enjoy the conversations, right? Because you
Right.
learn something new every single conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's up to us to do something with that.
Well, I agree. I think I'm going to be a better host just having you guys on here and sharing these insights. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
One thing I learned from you all that anybody listening should know is to track the performance of podcasts on listennotes.com. Right.
Mhm.
Before I met you, I didn't even know it existed. And it's a really good measure. It's really the perennial measure, right, of listener scores and ranking and so forth. So, because it doesn't matter if you have a lot of episodes if nobody's listening to them, right? Doesn't
Mhm.
matter if you're putting out content and it sucks, right? It's and there's a lot that goes into it. I think a lot of people who are thinking about starting a podcast, maybe they're younger, they don't have years and years of experience. So they need to approach it differently and just make sure they have really good questioning skills and get really good guests on, right? And because the guests will make the content good if they select them well and don't do all the talking, right? And so anyway, any last thoughts you guys would want to share before we sign off here?
I think there's something important to add that Cal Fussman said, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not about the question, it's about the right question.
Right.
It's about, and not necessarily even asking a question, because his podcast is called Big Questions. But it's how you answer the question and then what you do with it after that. And that's what Philip is just a genius at that part, right?
Absolutely.
And he just knows when to flick it over to me perfectly to for me to put my insights, because I don't ask any questions. He knows if I ask questions, I'm bored. So I never ask questions ever. So he's like, oh boy, he's asking questions. So
Yeah.
means he's got nothing to input.
That's funny. Or he flicks it over to you and you flick it right back to him, right?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I got
well,
nothing. Right.
Yeah, kind of.
Classic.
Well, I had
For
a good
sure.
I had a good time with you guys. This has been great. I really appreciate you being here. This is my 6th episode, so next one will be my last one. I'm going to
Cool.
quit at 7. So
Wow.
after that,
7
Yeah,
yeah, you're right on
that's-
time.
that's funny.
I'll teach
I-
everybody. I'll teach everybody how to get their ERC money faster for less, and then we'll quit.
I was
No,
gonna say, man,
just kidding.
I helped somebody launch their ERTC podcast, Brian Anderson and John Souza.
Really?
Yeah, and they got a few people in, and then they just fell off the map. So, but I
Wow.
I wish them the best. I mean, I helped them start it. We got it published, and then I
Yeah.
don't know what happened, but I know the ERTC is really helping businesses. I know that for a fact.
Well, it's a big deal, and there's a lot of people offering it out there. A lot of shysters.
Yeah.
We actually, if you get the time, come back and listen next week, because my host and colleague is they've kind of put together like a lending tree type service for ERC. So
Wow. Okay.
we work with a number of different firms, see who can come up with the best and the biggest number at the lowest price. They bid on it. And then we have a lender who will advance against that, so we can get it in 30 days. And
Yeah,
in
because
fact,
it's
we
not
have
cheap.
a meeting. No, and because you give up, 20% or so typically for recovering the money. But there are companies out there who think are, businesses who think, well, I'll just have my accountant do it. It's far more complex than that. You need to have a legal team and a tax team and having options for our customers. They seem to really like that. But being able to get the money quickly costs a little bit more because you pay a factoring fee, but getting the money in quickly We even have a source we're talking to this week who says they can get it to us in 5 days. So
That's
wow.
crazy.
for a business, and it's
Yeah.
up to $26,000 per W-2 employee for up to 500 employees. It's phenomenal. It's a great blessing. It won't last forever, but because the fund will dry up eventually. But
Yeah.
so that's our
Yeah.
guest next week. And
Wow, in 5 days. Most of the people I interviewed for that show have been waiting months
oh yeah, 6 to 12 months on average.
because
So,
it's the IRS.
yeah, I mean, does the government do anything fast? Right? I don't think
Well,
so.
they'll
but-
take your money.
They'll take
fast,
your
all
money
right.
fast.
That's
Yeah. Something
That's
about that.
right.
Yeah. Funny how that happens.
Yeah, right.
Anyway,
Yeah, well, one other thing,
always a
Patrick,
pleasure.
that at some point, well, I would love an introduction to Voice America,
Okay.
because I think that'd be great if we could share either a show a week or something like that with Voice America too. That'd be really cool if we could
Yeah,
do that.
I could definitely get you an audience. I think they'd be very interested in you. Yeah, basically you meet. See, I have an interesting story.
Uh-oh.
Oh, we hit the end of Zoom. It has died on his end.
Patrick, yeah, I think we lost you, man.
Yeah,
All right.
he's frozen.
Give it another
Yeah.
second. If not, anyways, I mean, we've got to start preparing for the next anyways.
Yeah, we're at what, 30?
Yeah. Oh man,
yeah.
we're gonna talk to
Yeah,
Rand
yeah.
Fishkin today. That'll be fun. Looking
Cool.
forward to that at 12. Oh, it's 1
Right.
o'clock your time.
Right.
All right,
Well,
man.
he's recording. So thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, Patrick, take it easy, brother.
Appreciate you, brother.
Cheers.
Peace.